Abandoned houses. Locked doors. Forgotten rooms. What secrets were hidden inside for decades? One woman's obsession. One man's discovery. And a cellar door that refused to stay closed. What would you do if the past came alive and refused to stay hidden? Watch closely, because these walls have stories they've been dying to tell. The collection in the root cellar. The Henderson farmhouse had stood empty for nearly 15 years when Marcus Riley arrived with his surveying equipment. The property developer had sent him to assess the land's viability for a new residential subdivision outside Amarillo. The house itself was a typical two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch that groaned under his weight. Marcus had seen dozens of these abandoned homesteads scattered across the Texas Panhandle. Each one a testament to the decline of small family farms. This one seemed unremarkable at first. Just another casualty of changing economics and an aging rural population. The interior reeked of mold and decay. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the stale air. Marcus moved through the ground floor methodically, taking measurements and noting structural damage. The kitchen still contained dishes in the sink, as if the occupants had simply walked away mid-meal. A calendar on the wall was frozen at September 2008. He photographed everything for his report, his footsteps echoing through the hollow rooms. It was in the pantry that he found the entrance to the root cellar. The wooden door was partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf unit. Marcus cleared the debris and pulled the door open, revealing steep stairs descending into darkness. The air that rushed up was cold and carried a strange chemical smell that made his eyes water. He clicked on his flashlight and began his descent. The root cellar was larger than expected, extending far beyond the footprint of the house above. The walls were lined with crude shelving made from scrap wood and cinder blocks. But it was not preserves or vegetables that filled these shelves. Hundreds of glass jars lined the walls, each one containing what appeared to be biological specimens suspended in yellowish liquid. Marcus moved closer, his heart beginning to race. The first jar he examined contained what looked like a human finger. The next held an eye. The third contained something he could not immediately identify. Something twisted and wrong. Marcus backed away, his breathing quickening. There had to be over 300 jars. Each one was carefully labeled with dates, numbers, and cryptic notations. Some labels bore names. Sarah, age 7. Michael, age 12. Patricia, age 45. He fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal in the cellar. Marcus needed to get out to call the police to report this nightmare. But something made him pause. On a workbench in the corner sat a leather-bound journal. Despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, he picked it up and opened to a random page. The entries were meticulous. They described procedures, experiments, attempts to preserve and study human tissue. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. The author referred to himself as a researcher, a pioneer in understanding the mechanisms of death and decay. He had been a doctor once, the journal revealed, until his medical license was revoked in 1982 for experimental procedures. He had retreated to this farm, to his family land, to continue his work in private. Marcus flipped through pages detailing the acquisition of specimens. Some came from funeral homes where the doctor had connections. Others were described vaguely as donations. But as the years progressed, the sources became more troubling. Drifters who stopped at the farm seeking work. Hitchhikers picked up along rural highways. People who would not be missed. The most recent entry was dated September 15, 2008. The same month as the calendar upstairs. It described the doctor's failing health and his satisfaction with his life's work. He had documented everything, preserved everything. His collection would outlast him, a testament to his dedication to science. The entry ended with a simple statement that he had taken his final dose of morphine and was going upstairs to rest. Marcus dropped the journal and ran. He stumbled up the stairs, through the house, and out into the bright Texas sunshine. His hands shook as he finally got a signal and called 911. When the police arrived 2 hours later, they descended into the cellar with cameras and evidence bags. The investigation would take months. Some of the specimens matched missing persons reports going back decades. Others were never identified. They found the doctor's body in the upstairs bedroom exactly where he said he would be. He had died peacefully in his sleep surrounded by medical texts and photographs of his specimens. The farmhouse was eventually demolished, but Marcus never went back to surveying work. Some nights he still woke up seeing those jars, those labels, those dates stretching back 30 years. The case made national news for a brief period, then faded from public consciousness. But in law enforcement circles it remained a cautionary tale. The Henderson farm became a reminder that evil could flourish in isolation, hidden behind ordinary walls, preserved in jars on shelves waiting to be discovered long after its architect had departed. Marcus tried to return to normal life, but the weight of what he had found followed him. He had walked into that farmhouse thinking about property values and subdivision layouts. He had walked out knowing that some places hold darkness that can never be fully cleansed. The land was sold eventually, though not for development. A preservation group bought it, citing historical significance. The cellar was filled with concrete, sealed forever. But Marcus knew that somewhere in evidence lockers and cold case files those jars still existed, still bore their terrible labels, still held their awful secrets. Years later he would learn that some of the victims' families had found closure through the discovery. DNA had identified remains that had been missing for decades. But closure, Marcus realized, was a relative term. For him there was only the memory of that cellar, those shelves, that journal written in elegant handwriting describing the methodical destruction of human lives in the name of twisted science. The Henderson farmhouse was gone, but its legacy remained. In the quiet moments when Marcus was alone with his thoughts, he could still smell that chemical preservative, still see those labels in his mind's eye. The abandoned farmhouse had held its secret for 15 years after the doctor's death. How many other abandoned places, Marcus wondered, held similar horrors? How many other cellars, attics, and hidden rooms contained evidence of lives taken, experiments conducted, madness pursued in isolation? He never spoke publicly about what he found. The police reports and news coverage told the story for him. But privately Marcus carried the weight of those 300 jars. 300 pieces of 300 lives preserved by a man who saw people as specimens, who valued knowledge over humanity, who died believing he had made a meaningful contribution to science. The true horror, Marcus realized, was not just what he had found, but what it represented about the capacity for evil to hide in plain sight, to masquerade as research, to justify itself with the language of discovery while committing the most fundamental of violations. The Henderson farm became a footnote in criminology textbooks, an example of serial preservation and the psychology of isolated predators. But for Marcus it remained something more immediate and personal. It was the place where he learned that abandoned houses are not always empty. Sometimes they are full of memories, full of evidence, full of the terrible things people do when they believe no one is watching. And sometimes those things wait patiently in the darkness, preserved and labeled, ready to tell their stories to anyone brave enough or unfortunate enough to find them. The nursery that never was. Jennifer Harding specialized in estate sales, traveling throughout rural Texas to catalog and liquidate the contents of abandoned properties. She had developed a reputation for efficiency and discretion, handling everything from valuable antiques to mundane household items with equal professionalism. When she received the call about the Morrison farmhouse outside of Lubbock, she expected another routine job. The property had been in probate for 7 years following the death of the last family member, a woman named Claire Morrison, who had lived alone for decades. The farmhouse was a substantial Victorian structure, unusual for the region, with ornate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. As Jennifer approached with her camera and inventory sheets, she noted the property's surprising good condition. Unlike many abandoned homes, this one had been maintained by the estate's trustee. The lawn was overgrown but not wild. The windows were intact. The structure appeared sound. Inside the house was a time capsule. Furniture from the 1950s sat exactly as it had been left. Magazines on the coffee table were dated 1987. The kitchen contained dishes washed and put away, with canned goods in the pantry arranged by type. Jennifer began her systematic documentation, room by room, photographing and cataloging everything. The downstairs revealed nothing unusual. Tasteful furniture, conventional decorations, and the accumulated possessions of a woman who had apparently lived a quiet, solitary life. The upstairs hallway contained 4 doors. 3 opened to reveal bedrooms and a bathroom, all neat and unremarkable. The 4th door was locked. Jennifer tried her master key ring, finally finding one that turned the stubborn lock. The door swung inward with a creak, revealing a room that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a nursery, perfectly appointed and spotlessly maintained. A white crib stood against one wall, its mobile of pastel animals still slowly rotating in the breeze from the opening door. A changing table was stocked with diapers, wipes and powder, all brands from the 1960s. A rocking chair sat by the window with a baby blanket draped over its arm. Shelves held toys and books. A dresser contained tiny clothes sorted by size from newborn to 12 months. But it was the walls that truly disturbed Jennifer. Every available surface was covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all showing the same thing. Babies. Newborns, infants, some just days old. They were professional hospital photographs, the kind taken in maternity wards. Each photo was carefully framed and labeled with a name, date and hospital name. Jennifer moved closer, examining the labels. Different names, different dates spanning from 1952 to 1985. Different hospitals across Texas and neighboring states. In the center of one wall hung a large portrait of a younger Claire Morrison in a nurse's uniform, smiling at the camera. Jennifer pulled out her phone and began researching. Claire Morrison had been a maternity nurse she discovered working at various hospitals throughout her career. She had never married, never had children of her own. She had retired in 1985 and returned to the family farm. Jennifer's unease grew as she examined the room more closely. A diary sat on the dresser and she opened it with trembling hands. The entries were written in precise handwriting, each one describing a baby. Their weight, their length, their APGAR scores. But also more subjective observations. How they smelled, how they felt, how they looked when sleeping. The entries grew increasingly obsessive over the years. Claire had not just cared for these babies. She had become fixated on them. A locked drawer in the dresser yielded to one of Jennifer's keys. Inside were hospital ID bracelets, hundreds of them, each one bearing a baby's name matching the photographs on the walls. There were also locks of hair, tiny fingernail clippings, and most disturbingly what appeared to be hospital records that Claire had no authorization to possess. She had been documenting these babies in intricate detail, collecting pieces of them, preserving memories of brief interactions during their first hours of life. Jennifer found a box of letters under the crib, letters written but never sent. They were addressed to the babies in the photographs, written when they would have been in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s. Claire had imagined their lives, created entire narratives about who they had become. She had written to them as if they were her children, discussing their fictional achievements, offering advice and expressing pride. The letters revealed a woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy, a parallel life where all these babies had been hers. As Jennifer continued her exploration, she found yearly birthday cards, one for each baby, purchased but never sent. There were Christmas presents wrapped and labeled, accumulating year after year. Claire had been celebrating these children's birthdays and holidays for decades, alone in this locked room, maintaining the fiction that they were somehow hers. The most chilling discovery was a series of maps. Claire had tracked the families, followed their moves across the country. She had newspaper clippings about some of them, documenting their graduations, their marriages, and their own children. She had watched from afar, collecting evidence of their lives, maintaining her imaginary connection to them. The tracking had continued until just months before her death. Jennifer sat in the rocking chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Claire's obsession. This was not a simple case of a childless woman mourning what she never had. This was decades of systematic collection, of boundary violation, and of living in a delusion. Claire had stolen pieces of these children, both physically and in her mind. She had created a life that existed only in this room, celebrating milestones for people who did not know she existed. The estate attorney arrived later that afternoon and Jennifer showed him the nursery. His face paled as he surveyed the room. The legal implications were staggering. Hundreds of people whose privacy had been violated, whose infant medical records had been stolen, and who had been unknowingly watched and documented for decades. The decision was made to seal the room, to contact authorities, and to begin the impossible task of notifying the now adult babies in those photographs. Jennifer finished her inventory of the rest of the house, but she could not shake the image of that nursery. The careful maintenance, the obsessive detail, and the years of delusion all pointed to a woman who had lost her grip on reality sometime after beginning her nursing career. Or perhaps Jennifer thought Claire had always been this way, and the nursing job had simply provided fuel for her obsession. The case made limited news. Privacy concerns prevented detailed reporting. But Jennifer learned that many of the people in those photographs were contacted. Some were disturbed, others philosophical. A few found it sad rather than sinister. But all agreed on one thing. It was a violation. Claire Morrison had taken something from them without permission and had woven them into her fantasy without their knowledge or consent. The farmhouse was eventually sold, and the new owners gutted the nursery, painting over the photograph-covered walls and disposing of the collected artifacts. But Jennifer never forgot that room. It represented something profound about loneliness, about the human need for connection, and about how that need, when twisted by obsession, could become something dark and invasive. Years later, Jennifer would still think about Claire Morrison alone in that farmhouse, surrounded by images of babies she had cared for briefly decades ago. She thought about the rocking chair by the window, about Claire sitting there imagining conversations with grown children who did not know her name. She thought about the birthday cards and Christmas presents accumulating year after year, gifts for ghosts, celebrations for people living their real lives hundreds of miles away. The Morrison farmhouse stood as a monument to the difference between love and obsession, between caring and possession. Claire had devoted her life to children who were never hers, creating an elaborate fiction that sustained her through decades of isolation. In doing so, she had committed a violation that most of the victims never even knew had occurred. Their baby pictures hung on a wall in a locked room in rural Texas, watched over by a woman who convinced herself she was their mother. The farmhouse was eventually sold, and the new owners gutted the nursery, painting over the photograph-covered walls and disposing of the collected artifacts. But Jennifer never forgot that room. It represented something profound about loneliness, about the human need for connection, and about how that need, when twisted by obsession, could become something dark and invasive. Years later, Jennifer would still think about Claire Morrison alone in that farmhouse, surrounded by images of babies she had cared for briefly decades ago. She thought about the rocking chair by the window, about Claire sitting there imagining conversations with grown children who did not know her name. She thought about the birthday cards and Christmas presents accumulating year after year, gifts for ghosts, celebrations for people living their real lives hundreds of miles away. The Morrison farmhouse stood as a monument to the difference between love and obsession, between caring and possession. Claire had devoted her life to children who were never hers, creating an elaborate fiction that sustained her through decades of isolation. In doing so, she had committed a violation that most of the victims never even knew had occurred. Their baby pictures hung on a wall in a locked room in rural Texas, watched over by a woman who convinced herself she was their mother. Jennifer eventually stopped doing estate sales. The Morrison farmhouse had shown her that abandoned properties could hold more than forgotten possessions. They could hold entire secret lives, delusions maintained for decades, and evidence of obsessions that flourished in isolation. The nursery that never was became for Jennifer a reminder that the most disturbing discoveries are sometimes not acts of obvious violence, but the quiet, methodical expressions of minds that have disconnected from reality while maintaining a veneer of normalcy. The photographs were eventually destroyed. The medical records were turned over to authorities. The tracking maps and letters were burned. But somewhere, Jennifer knew, were people in their 60s and 70s who had received strange letters explaining that a woman they never knew had spent decades imagining herself as their mother, collecting pieces of their infant selves and celebrating their birthdays in a locked room in an abandoned farmhouse on the Texas plains. The walls that whispered. David Chen was a demolition contractor hired to tear down the old Brennan farmhouse outside El Paso. The structure had been condemned after a roof collapse, and the city wanted it removed before it became an attractive nuisance for curious teenagers. David had demolished dozens of old buildings, and this job seemed straightforward. The house was a simple two-story frame structure probably built in the 1920s with obvious structural failures and decades of neglect. His crew arrived on a Monday morning with excavators and debris haulers. Standard procedure was to gut the interior first, removing anything salvageable before bringing in the heavy equipment. David led his three-man team inside, assigning sections and beginning the systematic stripping of the building. They worked through the morning, pulling out old fixtures, yanking down cabinets, ripping up floorboards. It was Miguel, the youngest crew member, who first noticed the sound. He called David over to the second-floor bedroom where he had been working. In the sudden silence after the crew stopped working, they could both hear it. A faint rustling, almost like whispers, coming from inside the walls. David assumed it was mice or rats, common in abandoned structures. He told Miguel to ignore it and keep working. But as the day progressed, the sound grew louder and stranger. It did not sound like animals anymore. It sounded almost like voices, multiple voices speaking too quietly to make out words, but clearly present. The crew gathered in the hallway listening. The sound seemed to come from all around them, from every wall, growing in volume as they paid attention to it. David made a decision to open up one of the walls. If there was an infestation, they needed to know about it before demolition. He selected a section of wall in the master bedroom and began carefully removing the plaster and lath. What he found made him step back in confusion. The entire cavity between the wall studs was filled with paper. Not insulation, but paper. Thousands of sheets of paper carefully folded and packed tightly into the wall space. As David pulled out handfuls of the paper, the rustling sound intensified. The aged paper crackled and whispered as it settled, creating the effect of voices. He spread some of the sheets out on the floor and began to read. They were letters. All of them. Letters written in different hands, different ink, spanning what appeared to be many decades. Letters from children to parents. Letters between lovers. Letters from soldiers to their families. Personal, intimate correspondence that should have been private. David opened another section of wall. More letters packed even more densely. Another wall. The same. As his crew worked through the second floor, they discovered that every interior wall in the house was filled with letters. The exterior walls appeared to have normal insulation, but every partition wall, every closet wall, every bathroom wall was packed solid with correspondence. They carefully extracted and examined hundreds of letters, trying to understand. The postmarks ranged from the 1930s through the 1990s. They were addressed to different people, from different people, mailed to different addresses. None of them appeared to be connected to the Brennan family. They were random letters collected from some unknown source and methodically packed into the walls. One of David's crew members had the presence of mind to photograph everything and call the police. While they waited for authorities to arrive, David continued reading. The letters told stories. A son writing home from World War II. A woman confessing her love to a married man. A father apologizing to a daughter he had abandoned. These were pieces of people's lives, their most private thoughts and feelings, stolen and hidden in the walls of this farmhouse. When the police arrived, they brought a detective who specialized in unusual cases. Detective Sarah Morrison walked through the house, examining the walls, reading sample letters and taking notes. She made some calls, did some quick research, and returned with a theory that made David's skin crawl. The Brennan family, she explained, had operated a waste management business for decades. They had held contracts with the post office to dispose of undeliverable mail. Dead letters, they were called. Mail that could not be delivered and could not be returned. It was supposed to be destroyed according to federal regulations. Instead, the Brennans had been bringing it home. But why pack it into the walls? The detective had an answer for that too. Harold Brennan, the family patriarch who had died in 2003, had been investigated in the 1970s for mail fraud. The charges had not stuck, but he had developed a paranoia about mail, about government surveillance, about privacy. He had apparently decided that the letters he was supposed to destroy were valuable, somehow worth preserving, worth protecting from authorities who might come looking for evidence of his earlier crimes. Over decades he had systematically packed them into his walls. As the house was renovated and expanded, new walls were built specifically to hold more letters. When he died, his children had abandoned the property, perhaps knowing what it contained, perhaps not. The house had stood empty for 20 years, filled with the voices of strangers, their words rustling in the wall cavities whenever the wind blew. The demolition was halted. Federal investigators arrived to examine the letters. Some were historically significant, they discovered. Letters from soldiers who had died in combat, whose families never received their final words. Business correspondence that shed light on historical events. Personal revelations that had never reached their intended recipients. But most were simply ordinary letters. Birthday cards that went astray. Love letters that missed their mark. Apologies never delivered. Thank you notes lost in transit. Decades of human connection interrupted and diverted into the walls of a Texas farmhouse instead of reaching the people who needed to read them. David and his crew were paid for their time, but the demolition never resumed. The farmhouse became a peculiar kind of crime scene. Postal investigators, archivists, and historians descended on it. They carefully extracted every letter, documented every piece of mail, attempting to catalog the scope of Harold Brennan's hoarding. The count eventually exceeded 100,000 pieces of correspondence. Some of the letters were delivered finally decades late. A World War II soldier's last letter to his mother reached his now elderly sister. A love letter from 1952 was delivered to the recipient's daughter, who wept reading her deceased mother's name on the envelope. A child's drawing sent to grandparents was given to the now middle-aged artist. But many letters could not be delivered. The recipients had died, moved away without forwarding addresses, or simply could not be found. These letters were archived, preserved as accidental time capsules, evidence of lives lived and moments that had mattered to someone once. David never finished the demolition. The farmhouse was eventually converted into a museum of sorts, a memorial to lost communication and stolen words. Sections of wall were preserved with their letter-filled cavities visible behind glass. Visitors could read selected letters, learning about the lives they represented, thinking about the connections that had been severed by Harold Brennan's obsessive hoarding. For David, the experience changed how he viewed demolition work. Every wall he opened afterward made him wonder what might be hidden inside. The Brennan farmhouse had taught him that buildings could hold more than structural components and insulation. They could hold secrets, yes, but also the stolen pieces of other people's lives, packed away and forgotten, whispering in the darkness for decades. The sound that Miguel had first heard, that rustling like voices, had indeed been voices in a sense. 100,000 messages trying to reach their destinations, their paper surfaces rubbing together in the wall cavities, creating a sound like whispered conversation. The walls had been trying to tell their story all along, waiting for someone to listen. Years later, David would still receive occasional calls from postal historians and archivists who were working with the Brennan letters. They would ask him to describe the condition of specific walls, the exact layout of the house, details about where certain batches of letters had been found. He always cooperated, feeling a strange responsibility to those letters, to the people who had written them, with the expectation that they would be read. The Brennan farmhouse had been filled with voices that should have reached other ears. Instead, they had been entombed in plaster and with their messages preserved but undelivered, creating a monument to communication interrupted. David thought often about Harold Brennan alone in that house, stuffing letters into walls, building a bizarre archive of other people's words. What had driven him to preserve what he was paid to destroy? What had he hoped to accomplish? The questions remained unanswered. Harold Brennan had left no explanation, no diary or manifesto describing his motivations. He had simply acted year after year, creating his wall of whispers, his archive of the lost and undelivered. And when he died, he left behind a house that spoke in rustling paper voices, telling stories that were never meant to be secrets, delivering messages decades too late. The photographs in the attic. Rebecca Torres made her living as a freelance photographer, but her true passion was documenting abandoned places. She ran a popular blog featuring photographs of forgotten buildings across the American Southwest. When a local historian told her about the abandoned Whitfield farmhouse outside Abilene, she jumped at the opportunity. The house had historical significance, she was told. The Whitfield family had been early settlers and the house dated to the 1880s. Rebecca arrived on a clear Saturday morning, her camera equipment carefully packed. The farmhouse was impressive despite its decay. 3 stories of Victorian architecture complete with a tower room and ornate woodwork. She spent the first hour photographing the exterior, capturing the way morning light fell across the weathered siding and broken windows. The interior was a photographer's dream. Dust motes floated in shafts of sunlight. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers of different patterns from different eras. Furniture remained in place, covered with sheets that had rotted into lace-like fragments. Rebecca worked methodically, floor by floor, capturing the beauty in decay. The attic access was a narrow stairway tucked behind a door she almost missed. The stairs creaked ominously under her weight, but they held. The attic was massive, running the full length of the house. Unlike the rooms below, it was cluttered with boxes, trunks, and furniture. And photographs. Thousands of photographs covered every surface. At first Rebecca assumed they were family photos, the accumulated visual history of generations of Whitfields. She began examining them, thinking they might provide historical context for her blog post. The older photographs were indeed family portraits. Stiff Victorians posed formally for the camera. Later photos showed more relaxed family gatherings, children at play, celebrations, and everyday moments. But as Rebecca worked her way through the chronologically arranged stacks, she noticed something disturbing. The photographs from the 1950s onward included images that clearly were not family pictures. Street photography. Candid shots of strangers. People who appeared to have no idea they were being photographed. The subjects were engaged in mundane activities. Shopping, walking, sitting in parks, eating in restaurants. The photographs were well composed, taken with skill, but their purpose was unclear. The more recent the photographs, the more disturbing they became. The subjects were often photographed repeatedly over time. A woman grocery shopping, then getting into her car, then entering her home. A man leaving work, then at a gas station, then through a window in his house. These were not random street photographs. They were surveillance. Rebecca found filing boxes containing negatives and contact sheets meticulously organized by subject and date. Each person photographed had been assigned a number. Subject 23. Subject 47. Subject 102. The numbers went up to 387. 387 people who had been unknowingly photographed, sometimes over periods of months or years. She found notebooks documenting the subjects' routines. When they left for work. Where they shopped. Which restaurants they frequented. Who they met with. The level of detail was staggering. The photographer had invested enormous time and effort into tracking these people, learning their patterns, documenting their lives without their knowledge. Rebecca's hands trembled as she photographed the evidence. This was not a historical curiosity. This was a crime scene. She called the police from outside the house, walking a quarter-mile down the road to get a cell signal. She tried to explain what she had found, but it sounded insane even to her own ears. A farmhouse attic full of surveillance photographs spanning decades. The detective who arrived 2 hours later was skeptical at first. He climbed to the attic expecting to find that Rebecca had overreacted to some old family photos. But his expression changed as he examined the evidence. He made a call, then another. Soon multiple police vehicles and investigator vans were parked outside the Whitfield farmhouse. The investigation revealed that Martin Whitfield, who had died in 2019 at age 84, had been a photographer by profession. He had operated a portrait studio in Abilene for over 50 years, well regarded for his skill and artistic eye. But the attic revealed his secret second career. For reasons never fully understood, he had spent decades photographing random people without their knowledge, tracking their movements, documenting their lives. Some of the subjects were identified and contacted. Their reactions ranged from disturbed to terrified. Several recognized photographs of themselves taken outside their homes, inside restaurants, in parking lots. None had known they were being watched. None could understand why Martin Whitfield had chosen them. There was no apparent pattern. Young and old, male and female from various backgrounds and neighborhoods. The only commonality was that they had all lived in or near Abilene at some point between 1955 and 2019. A psychiatrist consulted on the case suggested that Whitfield had been engaged in what is sometimes called observational obsession. He had found satisfaction in watching and documenting people without their knowledge and possessing information about their lives that they did not know he had. It was a form of control, a way of creating intimacy without risk or reciprocation. The photographs and documentation were seized as evidence. Some subjects filed civil suits against Whitfield's estate claiming invasion of privacy and emotional distress. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. The farmhouse itself became notorious locally, a place people drove past with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Rebecca published her photographs of the attic, though not the surveillance images themselves. Her blog post about the discovery went viral. She received messages from people who had known Martin Whitfield, who had sat for professional portraits in his studio, who had trusted him to capture their important moments. They were horrified to learn what he had done in his private time. One detail particularly disturbed Rebecca. Among the surveillance photographs were images of children. Kids playing in yards, walking to school at playgrounds. The images were not overtly sexual, but their existence was deeply unsettling. Whitfield had been watching children, photographing them, repeatedly documenting their routines. If he had lived longer, what might he have done with that information? The question haunted Rebecca as she tried to return to her normal work. She had gone to the Whitfield farmhouse seeking artistic inspiration and historical documentation. Instead, she had uncovered evidence of decades of violation. Every person in those photographs had been unknowingly watched, their privacy invaded, their lives turned into objects of study by a man they might have passed on the street without a second glance. The farmhouse was eventually demolished. The property was sold, the proceeds going to settle some of the lawsuits. But the photographs remained in evidence storage, thousands of images of people living their normal lives, unaware that they were being documented, catalogued, studied by eyes they never knew were watching. Rebecca stopped photographing abandoned places after the Whitfield house. The experience had soured her interest in forgotten buildings. She had learned that what appears abandoned can still hold active evil, that the past does not always stay safely in the past. The attic full of photographs had been a window into a mind that saw other people not as individuals with rights and privacy, but as subjects to be observed and documented at will. Years later, some of Whitfield's legitimate professional work was exhibited at a photography museum. The exhibit notes mentioned his technical skill and artistic vision. They did not mention the attic, the surveillance, the violations. Rebecca attended the exhibit opening and felt sick. She looked at his formal portraits, the smiling families and happy couples, and wondered who among them had also been photographed, secretly added to his private collection, filed away in the attic by subject number. The Whitfield case changed how Rebecca viewed photography itself. The same tool that could create art and preserve memories could also invade and violate. The camera that she had loved for its ability to capture beauty could just as easily be turned toward darker purposes. She thought about all the photographers she knew, wondering if any of them harbored similar obsessions, maintained similar secret collections. The farmhouse was gone, but its legacy remained. 387 people knew they had been watched. Hundreds more had been photographed but never identified, their images still in storage, evidence of violations they would never know occurred. Martin Whitfield had died believing his secret was safe, that his collection would remain hidden in the attic forever. Instead, a freelance photographer seeking aesthetic shots had exposed his decades of surveillance, turning his victims into visible people with names and rights rather than numbered subjects in his private archive. Rebecca eventually sold her camera equipment and took a desk job. She told people she was tired of freelancing, wanted stability. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Every time she looked through a viewfinder, she thought of Martin Whitfield's attic, of those thousands of photographs of the eyes behind the camera, stealing moments from lives that did not belong to him. The lens had become something sinister in her mind, a tool of violation rather than creation. The abandoned Whitfield farmhouse had taken not just the peace of mind of those photographed, but also Rebecca's passion for photography itself. The attic full of photographs stood as a monument to the hidden darkness that can exist behind apparently normal lives. Martin Whitfield had been a respected businessman, a skilled artist, a member of the community. And he had also been someone who spent decades violating the privacy of hundreds of people, creating an archive of stolen moments, documenting lives without permission or purpose beyond his own obsessive satisfaction. The farmhouse had held his secret until Rebecca climbed those narrow stairs. Now it was empty, demolished, gone. But the photographs remained evidence eternal of the watcher in the shadows, the lens in the darkness, the man who turned human lives into subjects to be studied and filed away. The cellar door that would not stay closed. Thomas Garrett had purchased the old Simmons property sight unseen at a tax auction. The price was right and the land itself was valuable, positioned on the outskirts of Austin's sprawling development. He planned to demolish the farmhouse and flip the land to a developer. It was supposed to be a simple investment that would take a few months at most. He never expected to find himself standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m. staring at a cellar door that refused to stay closed. The farmhouse was typical for the region, built in the early 1900s with additions from various decades, creating an asymmetrical floor plan. The cellar door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden door set into the floor at an angle. Thomas had noticed it during his first walkthrough. The realtor had mentioned that the cellar was just a small root storage area, nothing remarkable. Thomas had opened the door once, shining his flashlight down the narrow stairs into the darkness below. The cellar was indeed small, perhaps 10 feet square, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. Empty shelves lined the walls. It smelled of earth and age. Thomas had closed the door, latched it, and thought nothing more about it. But the door would not stay closed. The first time Thomas noticed it standing open, he assumed he had not latched it properly. He closed it again, making sure the latch was secure. An hour later it was open. He closed it. It opened. This happened repeatedly throughout his first day in the house. Each time he returned to the kitchen, the cellar door was standing open, the darkness below seeming to breathe cold air into the room. Thomas assumed there was a structural issue, perhaps the floor was not level, causing the latch to slip. He examined the door mechanism carefully and found nothing wrong. The latch was solid. The hinges were tight. There was no reason for the door to open on its own. He added a second latch, a simple hook and eye. The door opened anyway. On the second night, Thomas was awakened by a sound. A slow, rhythmic creaking. He went downstairs to find the cellar door not just open but swinging gently back and forth as if moved by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The kitchen was still and silent except for that creaking hinge. Thomas stood there watching the door swing, feeling his rational mind struggling to explain what he was seeing. He began to research the property's history. The Simmons family had lived there for 3 generations. The last occupant, Eleanor Simmons, had died in 2015. The property had sat empty since then, tied up in a complicated estate dispute that had finally been resolved through the tax sale. Nothing in the public record suggested anything unusual about the property or its owners. But Thomas kept digging. He found an old newspaper article from 1989. A brief mention of a missing person case. Rachel Simmons, age 16, had disappeared from the farmhouse. She had been home alone one weekend while her parents were traveling. When they returned, Rachel was gone. Her belongings were still in her room. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle. She had simply vanished. The case had never been solved. Rachel Simmons became another name in the database of missing persons. The family had continued living in the farmhouse, though Eleanor, Rachel's mother, had become increasingly reclusive in her later years. Neighbors reported that she rarely left the property. After her husband died in 2003, she lived alone until her own death 12 years later. Thomas went back down to the cellar with this new information weighing on his mind. He descended the stairs slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cellar appeared exactly as it had before. Empty shelves. Dirt walls. Nothing unusual. But as he stood there in the confined space, he noticed something he had missed before. One wall had a different texture than the others. He moved closer, examining it. The dirt was more compact, almost like it had been disturbed and then repacked. He touched the wall and some of the packed earth crumbled away. Behind it was concrete. Newer concrete poured sometime after the cellar had been dug. Thomas stood there as the implications washed over him. Someone had built a false wall in this cellar. Someone had poured concrete and then covered it with dirt to make it look like the original wall. Thomas went back upstairs, left the house, and called the police from his car. He tried to explain about the door that would not stay closed, about the missing girl, about the wall that did not match. The dispatcher was patient but clearly skeptical. Thomas insisted. Finally, she agreed to send an officer to take a report. The officer who arrived was young and thorough. He listened to Thomas's story, took notes, examined the cellar door. Thomas showed him the wall in the cellar, explaining his concerns. The officer agreed that it looked unusual but pointed out that unusual was not evidence of a crime. He said he would include the information in his report, that someone might follow up. 2 days later, 2 detectives arrived at the farmhouse. They were older, experienced. They had reviewed the missing person case from 1989. They had authorization to excavate the cellar if Thomas would grant permission. Thomas signed whatever they needed. The excavation began that afternoon. The false wall was carefully removed. Behind it was concrete poured to create a sealed chamber about 4 feet deep. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed there was something inside. A forensic team arrived with equipment to carefully break through the concrete. Thomas was asked to leave the property. He went to a hotel, watching news updates on his phone, knowing they were about to find Rachel Simmons. They did. 33 years after she disappeared, Rachel Simmons was found sealed in a concrete tomb in the cellar of her own home. The autopsy would later confirm that she had been alive when the concrete was poured, that she had died slowly in the darkness, her screams absorbed by the earth and concrete. The case became a murder investigation. Eleanor Simmons was dead beyond the reach of justice. But the investigation revealed that she had likely been responsible. Neighbors recalled that Eleanor had done some kind of construction project in the cellar around the time Rachel disappeared. She had claimed to be installing new storage shelves. She had done the work herself, refusing help, keeping the cellar locked for weeks. No one had questioned it. Why would they? The motive remained unclear. There were hints of a troubled relationship between mother and daughter, of arguments about Rachel's boyfriend about college plans. But nothing that explained why a mother would seal her daughter in concrete and then live in that house for another 26 years, walking over the cellar door every day knowing what lay beneath. Thomas never stayed another night in the farmhouse. He sold the property immediately at a loss, wanting nothing more to do with it. But the cellar door haunted his dreams. He could not stop thinking about those weeks after Rachel's murder. Eleanor Simmons opening the cellar door, looking down into the darkness where her daughter was entombed. Was that why the door would not stay closed? Some kind of residual energy, Rachel's final desperate attempts to escape, making the door refuse to be latched. Thomas did not believe in ghosts. But he believed in guilt and the weight of terrible actions, in the way places could hold echoes of the suffering that occurred within them. The farmhouse had been trying to tell its story, the cellar door standing open like a mouth, screaming silently, trying to draw attention to the horror below. The case made national news. Rachel's father, who had died never knowing what happened to his daughter, was spared the awful truth. But other family members learned that Eleanor had murdered Rachel, had sealed her away, had spent decades maintaining the secret. Some expressed shock. Others, more insightful or more honest, said they had always known something was wrong with Eleanor after Rachel disappeared. They had just never imagined this. The farmhouse was demolished after the investigation concluded. The cellar was excavated completely, the earth removed and sifted for any additional evidence. Rachel's remains were released to her family for burial. A small memorial service was held, attended by people who had been her classmates, who remembered her as a bright girl with plans for the future, plans that her mother had ended with concrete and earth. Thomas followed the case through its conclusion, feeling a strange obligation to see it through. He had been the one to find her, to notice the wall that did not match, to insist that something was wrong despite the skepticism of others. The cellar door that would not stay closed had led him to search more carefully, to question, to eventually uncover the truth. He thought often about those nights alone in the farmhouse, the cellar door standing open, the darkness below, breathing cold air into the kitchen. He thought about Eleanor Simmons walking over that door for 26 years, carrying the weight of her crime in silence. He wondered if the door had opened for her too, if she had spent decades fighting to keep it closed, to keep her secret sealed. The property was eventually cleared and developed. Luxury homes now occupied the land where the Simmons farmhouse once stood. The new residents knew nothing of the seller, the missing girl, the mother who had become a murderer. They complained about property taxes and lawn care, living normal lives on ground that had held such darkness. Thomas never bought another investment property. He returned to his regular job, his normal life. But sometimes late at night he would wake with a start, thinking he heard the creak of a cellar door swinging open. He would lie in the darkness, remembering that kitchen, that door that would not stay closed, that young girl who had died slowly in the dark while her mother sealed her away from the world. The Simmons farmhouse was gone, demolished and erased. But its story remained. Thomas carried it with him, a reminder that houses can hold terrible secrets, that sometimes the normal and mundane facades of family life hide horrors beyond imagination. The cellar door had tried to tell its story, opening again and again, refusing to keep the secret any longer. Thomas had listened, had paid attention when others might have dismissed it as a faulty latch or structural issue. In doing so, he had given Rachel Simmons something she had been denied for 33 years. A grave. Acknowledgement. An end to her mother's lie. The case file was closed. Rachel Simmons was no longer a missing person but a murder victim, her case solved 3 decades after her death. Eleanor Simmons was identified as her killer, though she would never face trial, never explain why she had done it, never show remorse or offer justification. The farmhouse where it happened was rubble, and then empty ground, and then new construction, the earth itself seeming to forget what it had witnessed. But Thomas remembered. The cellar door that would not stay closed had opened one final time to reveal the truth, and he had been there to see it, to make sure that Rachel's story was finally told. That was tonight's Whisper from the Shadows. Subscribe to Nightbound Whispers. And remember, the night is never truly silent.